Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to meet Percival Everett today. This gathering is made possible thanks to his journey from California, this incredible venue at Fundación Telefónica, and Laura Fernández, who has traveled from Barcelona. I guess you probably know her. Just in case, just to let you know, she's a famous writer. In 2021, her latest book, I really like the title, by the way, was awarded with narrative Ojo Crítico award, and it was chosen as the best book in 2021 by the booksellers. She's also a great literary critic, cultural journalism too, and she's specialized in American literature. She's also a big fan of Joshua Cohen, who was awarded with the Pulitzer Award last year. We're here at home. We believe in committed literature. If you don't know us, the Conatus publishing house, we've only been 5 years on the literary scene. We're called an independent publishing house. I don't really know the meaning of this, but for us it means that we have a publishing plan, searching for authors who don't know about anything. They're searching reality, how we live, what do we tell ourselves. This is the name of our collection, by the way. And this is when they seek different voices, different points of view with regard to reality. And this is why these authors are interesting. As for readers, we offer books that are a challenge to read. They will not find anything that is what they expect, something different and surprising. We find 8 books per year, more or less, of this type. We're a small publishing house, but also due to this publishing plan that we have. One of our authors is Percival Everett. From the beginning, I found him with Cuento Azul, published in 2018. He came to Spain too. I really liked his approach to secrecy, not as what is not said, but as what you don't say, what you don't talk about, and the impact on other people's lives. And then I think, well, you can read his biography. I'm just going to give you a few details after talking to him. He has got a spectacular sense of humor, an amazing sensitivity with regard to nature, animals, and also human beings as animals. We've also talked about this. And of course, a deep knowledge of philosophy, mathematics, and physics. This is very important because his next novel that will be published in 2024, Dr. No, scientist who teaches nothing, and he's a billionaire villain hires him, so to speak. It is a very interesting book with a lot of humor that follows the same approach of the trees. Percival has dealt with a very painful matter, which is racism, and it can be approached through humor as he does, but it is a serious matter that takes us to the depth of ourselves. We wouldn't be able to face in a real way racism as he does with his humor. So we hope to continue with more books. He has another one also. It's a secret. And I think that right now, well, he's written 30 books. So he knows a few things about writing. But apart from this, he has achieved his narrative strength, so to speak. And I'm not going to talk anymore because I'm sure that Laura has prepared great questions for him. Thank you for coming and thank you for reading our books. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. For me, it is an incredible honor to be here with Percival Everett. I'm a big fan. I read his book from 2012, Blackie Books. Those voices, that sense of humor was already there in that book. Using humor not to deactivate reality, on the contrary, to activate it, to squash it, so to speak. Sense of humor as a fascinating tool to understand the absurdity of life. Sidney Poitier, which is himself as a philosophy teacher, and he studied philosophy himself. He is deconstructing himself and everything around him. To add just a few details to his biography, he's written 20-30 books, many books. He's also a poet. He's a distinguished professor. To me, he's a genius, disruptive, postmodern author. Modern author. He has a degree in philosophy. He's also a painter, and it also explains Cuánto azul, so much blue, trying to understand the world through images. But well, we're here to talk about the trees, or to start talking about the trees, a book that was Bollinger Booker finalist. I think that when you are renowned as a writer in the US, awards start realizing that you exist. And not only do others know that you exist, but with Dr. No, you were awarded with the PEN Award. Many awards, but they're getting bigger and bigger, more and more. The noise created by his literature is getting louder, so to speak. I don't know if you who are here, all of you who are here, have read The Trees. To me, it was amazing to find Percival again in this book with this voice that is a massive and fun attack to the American white trash. In his books, all the points of view are slightly changed. Everything is broken and built again in a certain way. To me, it shows North America that is much more real than the real one, or the one that we see. Blind points also in the American reality that we can't even imagine. This village, Moni, in Mississippi, where The Trees takes place, is a sort of Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks in the south, with strange, hilarious characters, with some white trash characters that are proud of their hatred and their lack of culture. It's a sort of amazing slapstick, and he uses the format of detective novels. also with the MBI instead of the FBI, the detectives that arrive at this village to see what's happening, because white men, white trash appear, corpses appear, and next to that corpse, it seems to be always a black man's corpse. Both are harmed. The black man is holding the white man's testicles in his hand. And when the investigation starts, the black corpse always disappears next to the next white man's corpse. And as the story moves forward, white supremacy is turned into something that is more and more absurd, and the past lynchings are turned into something more and more atrocious. With humor, he does something amazing. He turns everything around. And from the other side, he's saying to the reader, look at this, what happened, what occurred, and from something atrocious that happened and terrific. What I think is incredible from Percival Everett is his voice, and that I would like to start with that by asking you about that, because he's explained that the story just appeared that he was playing tennis and he had a version of Light Lovell, Ain't No More Cane, interpreted by Lynne Lovett, and he mixed it with Rise Up, and he thought, okay, there's going to be a novel here. These people who've suffered lynching are going to come back and they're going to put an end to everything. So I would like you to go back to that moment, that connection with you as a writer. Where do these novels come from? How do you build them? Does the story start with the idea, the background idea, or as it, when you move forward, as it become more specific, all these characters, detectives, Dercy Ditrude, Mama Zedders, all of these characters appear as the story unfolds? How does a story by Percival Everett is created, and how does it move forward?
Well, first of all, I view any creation of art as magic. I don't know where these stories come from. I start with blank paper, and somehow miraculously it turns into paper that's full of words. In every book, people will ask me how long did it take to write, and it took 64 years to write The Trees, as it will have taken 66 to write the next one. It's an accumulation of experience that leads to any work being possible. The Trees was percolating in my mind for a long time before I even knew I was working on it, and I was told that I should start it when I heard that song again. It's a traditional song, and it's been done by a number of people, but there was something that morning listening to. There's a country. You might know who Lyle Lovett is. It's a country musician. Has a wonderful voice, but he has this black gospel group singing behind him, and one of the verses is "Rise Up," and so the concept of the victims of lynchings coming back came to me, and then I had to find a story, and I played with lots of ideas, and I don't know how many. And then one day I wrote the first sentence, and that was it.
Pero tomó de...
But was it already from the beginning a story belonging to a detective novel? Was this genre at the beginning? They had to come back like this. They couldn't be considered as culprits, of course.
That's a good question. I quite honestly don't remember when that came to me. My first instinct was to create the world of the descendants of the people who lynched Emmett Till, the young man whose body keeps showing up, or ostensibly showing up. I decided to use the detective genre because it's accessible to so many readers, and it allowed me to write at a certain pace. It would be easy. And when you start talking about lynching, things get sad right away, and it's hard to generate a momentum when everyone is depressed. And so adopting not only the detective story, but also the ironic and humorous story allows me to seduce the reader, trick the reader into entering the story so that I can do other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So your approach to literature, I have the feeling that you write to be able to understand the world, because the world is absurd in a way. Is this a statement that you would agree with?
I write because I'm trying to understand the world. I write because the world confuses me. I'm not attempting to offer any message or understanding of the world. Anyone who looks to a writer for some message about truth has misplaced their energy. The fact that I attempt to make novels to pay my bills is ample evidence of my mental deficiency. It's a crazy thing to do, and you shouldn't trust anything I say about the world. However, I can easily address what the world looks like. I can address what's confusing about the world. I don't explain it. I just show it to whomever will look.
Mm-hmm.
But it is clear that the voice of Percival Everett, regardless of the topic, always has this component of wanting to seduce through the absurd. Where does this come from? Before you were telling me that you were reading Couldn't Know It when you were a teenager, you placed his book in the glove, and one day you lost a game because you were reading the book. But I don't know which other humorous authors you've mentioned. You've quoted Mark Twain. Which other authors who play with humor have inspired you? Or when you decided that you wanted to write, did you read humorous books that sort of showed you the way of deactivating reality and as a way of entering literature as an author?
Well, you make it sound so smart, but I just make stories. That's pretty much it. I'm pathologically ironic. I don't think of humor. I'm not trying to be funny, but I view the world through an ironic lens, and I find most of it absurd. And that's not an unusual stance for people in the world, especially oppressed peoples, to make it through their world with humor. there was humor in the concentration camps during World War II. And the writing with humor is certainly nothing new. The writers who've influenced me have all been ironic. If it's funny, then I think that just happens organically. But the irony is the source of it. Cervantes is funny, and it's also satiric. He's making fun of novels of chivalry. Lawrence Stern, perhaps the greatest influence on me as a writer, is nothing but ironic, and certainly, in my estimation, hilarious. Samuel Butler, and of course Mark Twain. And then in the 20th century, Ralph Ellison in Invisible Man. The irony is present, and things are, because of that, humorous. But I think I resist that word just because when we say that something is humorous, we think of it in a different way. So I prefer the term ironic, but I certainly understand it when people say that something is funny or humorous.
I don't know in which way The Trees was received in the US. Did it generate debate? Do your novels generate debates? Because they show a part of the American society that they don't know where they are. I have the feeling that the inhabitants of the Mono and Mississippi, not only do they not know how the world works, they don't know how their own ecosystem works. They're not really there, so to speak. There's a phrase, and I'm not Sidney Poitier, they had very little ego and very little awareness. I have the feeling that the inhabitants of the Mono are like that. Does this also generate debate when your novels come out?
Well, in fairness, I have to say, quite honestly, that when I started this novel, I wrote the first few lines and I turned to my wife and said, I'm not being very fair to white people here. And then I said, well, screw that. Because I was also, in being unfair, addressing 200 years of the same treatment of people of color in my culture. The depictions of black people often being cartoonish and uni-leveled. So I decided to go with that impulse, but also it's, in all fairness, in my country, it's not a country of readers, and certainly the people who would be offended by the depiction of these characters don't read. And which is terribly upsetting for me because I would love to really piss them off. I've written a number of political works. For example, my novel Water Cure, which was an attack on the George Bush administration. I'll say now that I never thought I'd look back on the years of George Bush fondly, but now I do. And people would ask me, "Are you worried when you write something that attacks the government, sort of ferociously?" And I say, I'm not worried at all because they do not read. Again, that's a great sadness.
Bueno, aquí además.
And here, in The Trees, we have Mr. Orange, who's clearly Donald Trump, and in the background, how he got to power, the time he was there in term, sort of desire for ignorance and not knowing. This can be difficult even if this dark period has finished, but I think it also, in the novel, it is the right moment too, because it has awakened something from the past that was there, that is still there, that was quite visible, but suddenly he's sort of washed all that possibility, as you can see in the novel. So it is not only pertinent in the novel, but it shows clearly what is happening. And it generates debate on the other side. Those who read, and they might think, well, this is happening. I'm not the only one who's seeing this. And maybe, I don't know, when you wrote it, you thought it was a sort of political activism.
Well, certainly it is of a sort, and I might say that you're quite the optimist. Yes, yeah. One hopes that it will generate that kind of debate. The sadness is that no matter when I had written this book, it would have been relevant in American culture. American society. The death of George Floyd came just months after I finished the novel, and so I actually pushed my publisher to publish it sooner than later, and that might have been the real work of activism, was when I essentially demanded that they do it earlier. The fact that these deaths continue, but that the murderers change, is of course alarming. Certainly true, and it's like a disease. As we've just come out of something that involved the disease, COVID and all, I can use the metaphor that one of the things about viruses, some of them, COVID apparently one of them, is that they change their antigenic coats so that when our bodies invent antibodies to go attack the disease, they can't find it because it's become something different. Likewise, in our culture, when we go to find the evil that's being perpetrated upon all of us, black and white, because it affects everyone profoundly in different ways, the way it looks is different. The acts become sanctioned. The acts are committed by people whom we should trust, and so the pernicious evil remains, but life goes on.
In the novels published in Spain, apart from the trees, Percival Everett and How Much Blue, So Much Blue, there's an idea of violence, unleashed violence, that can take place at any moment in the US or in El Salvador, and So Much Blue, but it is related more to Americans, because there's always an American character who unleashes this violence. This is present in this novel and in others. And obviously racism, not only in Sidney Poitier. If you haven't read the novel, this is the name of the protagonist. I'm not Sidney Poitier. And this character lives in a sort of bubble because he has a lot of money, his mother invested well, and when he goes out into the world, the first thing that he does is to take a car, and obviously a scene occurs. He's stopped because of the color of his skin, he's detained, he's taken to a farm to work, certain things happen. It is a book full of adventures and sort of crazy. This idea of violence, especially when you're black in the United States, the violence is always present, is always there. I suppose you are greatly concerned about this matter in your country, and you see it all the time, and you experience this with a certain amount of fear, right? Always, at all moment.
Well, certainly, it's not the case that I think I ever feel fear walking down the street. But if I were to see the blue flashing lights of a police car behind me as I'm driving, it's a different experience for me than it would be for a white driver. And it's not because I'm fleeing, it's because I know too many stories that we all know. The United States is a sadly and profoundly violent place, and the violence is like weather. Certainly, you can go into some very rough places and expect violence, but the shootings that happen in the United States happen everywhere. And you never know when it will happen. It may never happen in your town or your community. But that's the same thing that people in other towns and communities thought all along. You don't know who has the kinds of guns that would allow them to perpetrate this kind of evil on other people. But they have them. Do you know in companies sometimes they have a sign that will say 314 days since an accident, and they're proud of their record of safety. We can't have that sign in the United States. It would always be 1 day since a mass shooting, and then the next day it would be 1 day since a mass shooting. It would be the same thing over and over again because they happen every day somewhere, but you don't know where it will be. It's the bad lottery. You can go buy a ticket and maybe win $1 million, but you can go to the grocery store and maybe win the bad lottery.
As a writer, are you angry, and as a reader too, that American literature sometimes highlights these things? I have the feeling that through your books, a reader can know better the United States than what is in the media on TV. There's a sort of screen idealization. But it is the world that is in your books exists and is probably more real, and they're not represented as they should be. As a creator, do you feel alone, or does it make you angry to see maybe this other image of the US?
No, sure. What do you do? I trained horses for 14 years of my life. And one of the things I learned the first day I was with animals that weigh 10 times as more than I do is you don't achieve anything by getting upset with it. And you certainly don't achieve anything by stopping your thinking and reacting. My way of thinking through what goes on in my culture is making art. If I were a different person, I might be a politician. I might be an activist in a lawyer, but I happen to be an artist. Which makes me an optimist. That I think that, well, in this city, there is an example of there is a work that keeps me making art, and that is Picasso's Guernica. Not everyone in the world has seen the painting. Not everyone in the world, when it was made, very few actually saw the painting. But it changed the world. It's that kind of belief in art that I embrace and keeps me working.
¿Te refieres a algún cuadro en concreto?
So you were mentioning the Guernica, right?
Estoy atento. Sí, esto de los caballos.
Horses, yes, I was going to mention them at the beginning, but I forgot. You spent many years training horses. You studied philosophy. You're a professor at university. You trained horses for many years. You're also a painter. When was literature stronger than painting? Or did you always write as a teenager? When did you start disappearing, so to speak, in what you write instead of in what you paint?
Well, I've painted for a longer time than I've written. But I never intended to make a living as a painter. It was just something I did. The writing came when I was working on a PhD in philosophy, and I decided that I hated philosophers, and it could have been that I was and I think it's true that I was too young. I was immature. I graduated university young, not because I was terribly bright at all, but because they told me that if I took so many courses, I wouldn't have to pay as much money, and so I took them and graduated. So the philosophy I found too scholastic. It didn't address the world the way I wanted to address the world, and I did a certain kind of philosophy which consisted in writing scenes in which people spoke to each other about philosophical ideas. So I was writing fiction anyway, and it occurred to me that writing fiction was a better way for me to do philosophy. And so when I was told to go write my dissertation, I think I used some foul language and said no, and wrote fiction.
Vaya, no.
Wow. I imagined that you'd read a lot, and I thought that you hadn't written that much until that moment, right?
Anything until that moment, but I was a reader. I read all the time, and I read lots of fiction then. Oddly, now I don't read that much fiction. Now I read mostly philosophy and I'm sorry to say it, math.
Claro, bueno, toda esa parte.
Yes, of course, that scientific side of the next book is maybe associated to the deception with regard to philosophy and humanities, or has it always been there, this passion for science? It has to do with understanding the world in a different way.
I understand some of it, so I use it. I and a lot of the math I write about, I don't even understand. Writing for me is an excuse to study something. I have a novel called Watershed that the main character is a hydrologist. I didn't study hydrology in school, but I read 25 or 6 books on geomorphology and hydrology, and then I went out for 3 months and worked with a hydrologist to do research for the novel. Not because I needed a scientific basis for the novel, but I needed to understand what somebody who did that job, I wanted to know how that person would think about the world. And that gave me a certain amount of freedom to create the world that he inhabits.
Entonces,
So, documentation for the trees, the lynching, all the names that appear, that real names, and it's incredible when you reach that moment in the novel. How did you do the research for the novel, the preparation of the historical part?
Well, archives, histories, some interviews of the few people I could find who had actually witnessed or had family members who had been lynched. That wasn't necessary for the making of the story. What really made the story was that list of names. In fact, for me, that list of names is the entire novel. The novel that I've written is a frame that gives that list a place to live. In that list, and this is perhaps the biggest thing that this novel has given back to me. Money's great. Awards, I don't even believe in them. But after I published this novel, there are 2 entries. One is David Walker, and then David Walker's wife, and then after that, David Walker's 4 children. And that's sad enough. But a woman from the state of Tennessee sent me a letter, an old-fashioned letter, in an envelope, which is great to receive a letter. And she told me what David Walker's wife's name was. And so now when I read from the novel, I read David Walker, Annie Walker, David and Annie Walker's 4 children. And even as I say that now, I get chills.
bueno, la sensación...
The feeling in the novel, and also as a reader, and I think all of the people here present who've read it, it's a sort of vaudeville, and then it turns darker and darker, and that moment that when you reach the list is yes, gives you chills. Yes, it's that story of that woman from Tennessee is beautiful. I wanted to ask you, is this still alive? Is this talked about? Does this fit in with regard to the history of the US? Is this talked about?
You mean lynching? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, just recently there was a movie released about Emmett Till's mother, and called Till. Now, and it was a big release movie, and whether it was good or not, I can't say, but it was an important one. And in the 90s, there was a film, Mississippi Burning, which is a very nice movie with Gene Hackman and I can't remember the other actor's name, that addresses the subject of lynching. It should never be far from the American mind. However, even as I speak, there are people in the United States, in the state of Florida, in the state of Texas, who would eradicate all history because it presents the United States in a bad light. They have attempted to remove the teaching of slavery in schools. And so certainly the history of lynching is on the, to use a bad metaphor in this case, on the chopping block. It's in the forefront of the American consciousness every day when we read stories of policemen shooting or someone else shooting black people for whatever reason they find. So I should say the practice keeps happening, but the discussion of it, not so much.
Focusing on some of the characters of the trees, I wanted you to talk about the detectives a little bit. And you explained before that the story of the detectives was a way of making it a friendlier story for readers. They're very well created, destructed at the same time. And these detectives are stereotypes, but not really at the same time. And maybe if you can talk about the characters a little bit that do the investigation, Jim Davis, Gertrude, the background in this village and what exists already in the village. It's a decoration at the same time. There's a background that is not seen and where they're working to try to change things or to try to help those who are trying to take revenge. So I wanted you to talk about the characters of the novel a little bit as a creator of memorable characters that I think you are.
Well, I have to say that I apologize for this, but I forget my novels almost as soon as I finish them. And since then, I've written 2 books, and to tell the truth, I can't remember the last one I wrote. I try to make my people as real as I can. I remember thinking about these 2 detectives and the fact that they occupy, their occupations are ones that are problematic, certainly for in Mississippi to be a black police officer, and I could only imagine this. I never talked to a black policeman in Mississippi. Certainly there are some, but and I apologize, but I never have any interest in talking to policemen. I do try to avoid that, but it must be a confusing position to be in because you're supposed to be an authority, but you're not an authority. You're historically aligning yourself with a group of people that have been problematic for your people, and that must be. And yeah, it was, and it's relatively new. The first black policeman in New York City wasn't until the early mid 20th century, and it wasn't until many years later that there was any policeman in the New York police force in a position of any sort of any power. Since then, there's been a black mayor of New York, a black mayor of Los Angeles. Still, those positions are slightly different from being a policeman.
maybe we can open the Q&A. There might be some questions.
Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero decir que...
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I've had a very good time reading your book. I haven't finished it yet, but I've had it has been really fun. I think that has been the crime novel, the funniest crime novel ever, with a great background. Just two very simple questions. Well, first of all, of course, the first thing that I have to do is to say thank you for writing this book, of course. But two questions. First of all, the number of records, the number of lynchings, is that a real number? And the second question, the history of the two detectives at the beginning, I have the feeling I also write, and I do my best, but I have the feeling that the characters moved on their own. And at specific moments in time, you said, "Hey, I have to try to make this work." But it seems that they were doing whatever they wanted. These two characters. These are the two questions. Thank you.
Can you repeat the questions for me, please? It's a lot of sound. I'm asking if the translator can repeat.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Well, it seems that it was a little bit of feedback. So the first question is if he wants to know if the number of lynchings was right, and the second question is that it seems that the two detectives, the two characters, were moving on their own. As if you were not controlling them. So yeah, these are the two questions.
First, the number of lynchings that I mentioned might be a conservative estimate. I suspect there are more, just as anything that gets reported is usually less than those actual events. It's nice to hear that it seems like they were moving on their own, but the sad part is that when I'm making a novel, I am God, and I move everybody.
¿Hay más? ¿Hay alguna pregunta?
Any more questions, comments?
Well, I can ask you
Huh? Oh, certainly.
Well, I don't want to do any spoilers for the people who haven't read the book, but I'm guessing that there's not going to be like another part, like it ends like it ends. Mm-hmm. Because it ends like really, really open, and I was like, oh my god, I need more of this. But I guess it gets like unconcluded. Or finished.
I've never written a sequel to anything. I'm sorry, but that's the end of it.
I will also ask my question in English. My Spanish is horrible. So recently I heard an interview with Isabel Wilkerson. I've only read one of her books, but it's The Warmth of Other Suns. Mm-hmm. As an American, who's here in Madrid for work, by the way, she used an analogy of racism and our history in the United States, like buying or living in an old house, and how if I'm now the owner, and I'm assuming ownership, I can't really be blamed for faulty plumbing and wiring, but am I going to accept responsibility for either burning the house down or letting it continue to degrade or upgrade the systems? Do you agree with that analogy? Do you feel like that's something that someone of my background or my appearance could work with? And perhaps do you have a better analogy for where we are today in the United States?
It's so strange that you should have asked that in that way, because I just used that same analogy with earlier today. The question put to me was, am I comfortable enough to remain in the United States? And it's my home. And if my house had a bad foundation, I would see what I could do to fix it if I wanted to stay in my home. and I do. So yes, in that way, yes. But you can't repair a house unless you uncover and expose the injuries to it through time and through contact with people, weather, and whatever. So an honesty about the problems is absolutely necessary for the correction of those problems. Thank you. That was it.
I have a question about your writing process. I wanted to ask you if you outline your stories or if you write as you go, and also ask how many hours per day, if you have a certain discipline to your writing.
First of all, I have no discipline at all. If you come to me and say you want to go to a movie, I go to a movie. I don't write every day. I don't have a schedule because I hate schedules of any kind. I had schedules when I worked with horses because horses like schedules. But I work all the time. Writing is not only sitting down with paper and pencil, but observing, and for me, thinking, and I realize I've written a lot of books, and in some ways I find it in bad taste, but I have, and I attribute this to one constitutional feature of myself, and that is I do not feel stress. It's just books. What if somebody hates my book? Maybe they'll like the next one. It's not a big deal. The things that people live through, the things that people do in the world, it's just books.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Any more questions? I wanted to ask you that you just said that books are just books. That passion for realizing that it's not that important at the end of the day. Has anything happened that led to you thinking that way? Or has it always been like that?
I believe that art is really important. And I believe that literature is really important. But nobody's shooting at me. I'm comfortable. And it's hard for me to look at a world in which so many people suffer so greatly and become upset about much. Even in my own culture, I live not far from people who are struggling. The homeless problem in Los Angeles is terrible. There are people who have no place to go. I'm fortunate. If my next book doesn't get published, I'm not homeless. So it can't be that important when I see that kind of suffering. I can only hope optimistically that somehow the art we make can move all of us to address those things. But I can be optimistic, but I'm not naive, and so I don't expect it. I would love to be surprised. I don't expect to be surprised.
Bueno, si alguien tenéis alguna...
Any more questions, comments? Well, it seems that we're running out of time. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Percival, who is a charming person, for coming. Thank you to Laura for her collaboration. We have books of the trees, if you haven't bought it yet, and also So Much Blue, which is a completely different register, but he is capable of doing grand things with all kind of registers. Tomorrow he will be at Geometria's bookstore and also at the book fair tomorrow afternoon at Conatus stand. Thank you very much for coming.